Edward had to return to England to raise more money. While at home, he heard that a great French fleet had been collected for the conquest of Flanders and a subsequent attack on England. The Royal Navy, there was a very, very minimal Royal Navy at this point. Of course, in centuries to come, the Royal Navy is famous for being gigantic and sort of all-powerful. So not that long ago in the scheme of things that any sort of navy was put together. So we have got a Royal Navy, but it's far from completely dominant or ruling the waves in any real sense. It's not until Henry VIII or, well, Elizabeth really, that all that starts to get dialed up in earnest, which is a long way off still. Hastily raising all the ships he could gather from London and the Kink ports, the king set sail to seek the enemy. He found them in harbour at the Flemish port of Sluys. I may be pronouncing that wrong. It's spelled Sluys. And I've seen many, many people pronounce that word in many, many, many different ways. If there's anyone from Belgium or Holland who wants to correct me on exactly how that's pronounced, but I think it's Sluys, okay? It's the Battle of Sluys. And there brought them to action, i.e. a big naval engagement, big naval battle. They, the French, had changed their ships in 3 lines and built up barricades upon them. But by pretending to fly, Edward induced them to cast loose and follow him, and when they had got out to sea, turned and attacked. The English archery swept the enemy's decks, and then the king and his knights clambered up and boarded vessel after vessel, till well nigh the whole French fleet was taken. And this is in 1340. So many people said about this Battle of Sluys that it was sort of like a land battle which just kind of happened to take place on the decks of ships, because the English just did the thing that they've been doing now for a while and will continue to do, of just using archery, the longbow, to just rain down death on their enemies. And there's sort of no reply to that. The longbow, not many people had decent armour anyway, only if you was extremely rich would you have like chainmail and plate mail. And so most people were essentially unarmoured. Certainly sort of a leather bodkin or something is no defence against the longbow. None at all. You punch straight through that, easy peasy. So if you can rain down, each man can rain down 4, 5, 6 arrows a minute, maybe more, then you're going to get hundreds, maybe thousands of arrows raining down in a few minutes. And it's a rain of death. And so they did that from ship to ship at this Battle of Sluys. And so we won that one as well. And Edward himself, as sort of a warrior king, personally getting involved there, like Nelson, personally boarding enemy ships, but apparently was wounded mildly in that. But, you know, it's an actual battle scar. It's kind of cool, isn't it? It's like Caesar or Alexander personally getting involved in the melee, the hand-to-hand fighting, or like Richard. It's quite a feather in your cap to do such a thing. Oman goes on saying, no such glorious day had been seen since Hubert de Burgh won the Battle of Dover 120 years before. The victory of Sluys freed England from the danger of invasion, but did nothing more. For when the king landed in Flanders and pushed forward against France, he again failed to break through the line of strong towns that guarded Philip's frontier, and had to return home foiled. On coming to England, he fell into bitter strife with his parliament, who were far from contented with the repeated checks in Flanders. Edward began by charging his failure on his ministers, and dismissed them all, from the Chancellor and the Archbishop of Canterbury downwards, accusing them of having misappropriated the taxes. There's a whole story there I won't go into because I just haven't got time nor the inclination. But there's a whole story there about how Edward blames everyone else around him, perhaps fairly, perhaps not, but there's a sort of a changing of the guard at this point. A lot of the power players in the realm are swapped out for new people. So that's a big thing that shouldn't really be ignored. Again, won't go into it in detail, but just note that Edward is ruling as a true king now, right? A king that wasn't, actually powerful, who wasn't wielding power genuinely, wouldn't be able to do such a thing. He might find himself on the receiving end of his father's treatment, being, some sort of baronial revolt or a civil war, find himself imprisoned, dethroned and imprisoned. But Edward III faces no such repercussions because, well, he's a strong king. The story goes on, we're told, quote, he announced that he would bring them to trial. These were a lot of the so-called sort of disgraced ministers. He would bring them to trial and appointed a special commission for the purpose. This led to a vindication of the ancient right of trial by a man's equals. For John de Stratford, the Archbishop, insisted on being tried in Parliament by the barons his peers, and carried his point against the king's strenuous opposition. He was, of course, acquitted, as nothing could be found against him. The Parliament only consented to grant the king fresh supplies when he swore that 1. To let them appoint a committee to audit the accounts of the money, and 2. To take no further taxes or tallages, but confine himself to the duly voted suppliers, and 3. To choose his ministers only with Parliament's consent, and make them answerable to Parliament for malfeasance in their office. And all that took place in 1341. If these conditions had been kept, the crown would have been completely under control of the National Council, but Edward shamelessly broke them when fortune turned in his favour. So Edward's a bit of a low ebb and sort of kind of has to do what Parliament's asking him at that moment, because he's got no other choice. He needs money, so he's going to promise to do what Parliament want. But if and when, more importantly, when the tide turns and he finds himself militarily successful and with a bunch of money in his pocket, he's not going to necessarily, or he's definitely not going to, abide by all the things he's promised to there. Classic medieval king. England had now been 2 years at war with France and had gained nothing thereby save the destruction of the French navy at Sluys. France had fared equally badly, and in a lucid moment the kings signed a truce. But both Edward and Philip and their subjects had come to dislike each other so bitterly that no end could be put to the war till one or other had gained a decisive victory. The struggle was soon renewed on fresh ground, the Duchy of Brittany, where a disputed succession had occurred. With strange want of logic, Philip VI backed the claimant, whose pretensions were based on a female descent, so i.e. backing up Edward's entire concept of his claim. But there you go. And Edward was the one who claimed as next male heir under the Salic law. So both show themselves to be hypocrites, really, or politicians, should we say. Thus each supported in Brittany the theory of descent which he repudiated in France. After much indecisive fighting, both in Brittany and on the Gascon border, Edward determined on a new invasion of France in 1346. Giving out that he would sail to Bordeaux, he really landed near Cherbourg in Normandy, where the enemy was not expecting him. He had determined to fight the campaign with English forces alone, and no longer to rely on untrustworthy continental friends, the Flemish. With 4,000 men-at-arms, 10,000 bowmen, and 5,000 light Welsh and Irish infantry, he pushed boldly through the land, sacking Saint-Lô and Caen, and driving the local levies of Normandy before him. But he had cut himself loose from the sea, and as his course drew him into the interior, the French began to muster on all sides of him, in great numbers and in high wrath. It was evident that he ran great danger of being surrounded, and would certainly have to fight for his life. When he reached the Seine, the river Seine, King Philip broke down all the bridges to prevent his escape, and it was more by chance than good generalship that the English army succeeded in forcing a passage. Hearing of the vast numbers that were coming against him, Edward now turned north, but he was again checked by the river Somme, and only got across by fighting his way over the dangerous sea-swept ford of Blanchetec, near the river's mouth, in face of the levies of Picardy. So very lucky there to escape by the skin of his teeth. Very lucky that the ebb of the tide was in his favour at just the right moment. Otherwise he would have been surrounded and forced to fight a battle right there. 3 days later, he was overtaken by the French at Crecy, in the county of Ponthieu, and had to turn and fight. King Philip had brought up a vast army, some 12,000 men-at-arms and 60,000 foot soldiers, including several thousand Genoese crossbowmen, who are reckoned the best mercenary troops in Europe. So Edward and his much smaller English army staring death in the face now, massively outnumbered. Edward drew up his host on a hillside north of Crecy, placing his archers in front, with bodies of dismounted men-at-arms to support them. 2/3 of the army were arrayed in the front line under the nominal command of Edward, Prince of Wales, the 15-year-old son and heir to the king, later to become known as the Black Prince. Edward kept the rest in reserve higher up on the hill under his own hand, so being completely forced to take refuge on a hilltop. Well, we remember what happened at Halidon Hill against the Scots, and at Sluys, the English archer. Oman continues saying, Crecy was the first fight which taught the rulers of the continent the worth of the English bowmen. When the vast French army came up against them, they easily repelled every attack. of which there were a great many. First, they riddled with arrows the Genoese crossbowmen, who could make no stand against them, for the archer could shoot 6 times before the Genoese could wind up their clumsy arbalests for a second discharge. Then, when the French cavalry advanced, they shot down men and horses so fast that it was only at a few points that the enemy ever succeeded in reaching their line, and coming to handstrokes with the Prince of Wales and his dismounted knights. At evening, the French fled. Apparently, they attacked, like, what was it, 16 times, 18 times? The French just kept trying to attack the hill at Crecy and failing every single time. You would have thought after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 attempts, you would have thought they would realise it was an indomitable position, but no. We're told that Edward III, Oman doesn't tell this, but we know that Edward III took up some sort of position in a windmill up there for the very best view. And at one point, the young Black Prince, he's only about 15, asks for reinforcements from his father, and the king is supposed to have said, no, let the boy sink or swim, basically. Let him earn his spurs. If he's going to be a king of England, if he's going to be a warrior king like me, or like my grandfather, Longshanks, at some point he's got to actually throw the dice and risk his life and get involved in fighting hand to hand. At 15, that's quite a baptism of fire, but we all know that the Black Prince is a great warrior in his own right and does in fact survive the day, passes the test with aplomb, really. Omar says, at evening the French fled, routed by less than a third of their numbers, before King Edward and his reserve had occasion to strike a single blow. Edward knighted his son on the field, the first victory of the celebrated Black Prince, who was to prove as good a soldier as his father. When the French dead were counted, it was discovered that the English archery had slain 11 dukes and counts, 83 barons, 1,200 knights, and more than 20,000 of the French soldiery. John, King of Bohemia, had come to help Philip VI. Though he was old and weak of sight, he was also among the slain. Great story about him is that he was supposed to have, so old and blind that he could barely sort of ride a horse in the right direction, and he ordered his men to sort of lash him to his horse and just sort of point him in the right direction and ride alongside, almost thigh to thigh with his cavalry, straight into battle, even though he was a really old man and couldn't really see. But, he obviously, a bit of a suicidal thing, was prepared to die in battle gloriously, kind of gloriously, sort of pointlessly as well, depends on how you look at it. Omar says, on the other hand, the English had lost less than 1,000 men, and this was on August the 26th, 1346. So a massive reversal then for the French, a great victory for the English. It looked like Edward and his whole army were going to get wiped out, and, well, they turned it into a famous victory.